People assume that the hardest moments of my life happened overseas. They picture sandstorms, alarms screaming in the middle of the night, decisions made with seconds to spare. And yes, those moments tested me. But the truth is, the moments that almost broke me didn't happen under fire. They happened at family dinners, on muted phone calls, and finally, on the day my own parents chose a vacation over my engagement ceremony. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 35 years old, a Navy officer with 8 years of service and 3 deployments behind me. I've learned how to stay calm when everything is falling apart. What I hadn't learned, until recently, was when to stop trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth celebrating. For most of my adult life, I did at home exactly what I did in uniform. I absorbed pressure. I adapted. I covered gaps. My parents, Caroline and Richard, were never openly cruel. They were just absent in the ways that mattered. My sister, Lydia, made up for it with jokes that landed a little too sharp to be accidental. At family gatherings, she'd laugh and say things like, "Natalie will probably marry some guy with a Jeep and a buzz cut," while my mother would quietly correct my posture if I showed up in uniform, as if my career were something impolite that needed smoothing over. No one ever said they were ashamed of me. They didn't have to. The silence did the work for them. In the Navy, my record spoke clearly. 3 deployments. Commendations for tactical communications. A reputation for being steady under pressure. I was the officer people trusted when systems failed and plans unraveled. But at home, none of that translated. What mattered was that Lydia had just landed another promotion in marketing, a job my mother could explain easily to her friends over wine. When people asked about me, the answer was vague. "Oh, Natalie's still in the Navy." Still. As if I were lingering in a phase I'd eventually outgrow. When I got engaged, their reaction was polite and distant. Thin smiles. Short congratulations. My father shook my fiancé's hand like he was doing me a courtesy. They didn't ask questions. They didn't ask how we met, or what our plans were. I didn't volunteer much either. Part of me already knew it wouldn't matter. Mark was someone I'd met through work. That much was true. What I didn't say was that Mark held a rank most officers never reach, or that he worked at a level where decisions didn't make headlines, but shaped them. I didn't hide it out of shame. I hid it because I didn't want their approval to suddenly depend on it. The engagement ceremony mattered to me. It wasn't just a formality. It was the moment we made things official in front of our command, signed the paperwork, and celebrated with the people who actually knew us. When I told my family the date, Lydia smiled and said she, Mom, and Dad had finally booked their dream trip to London. Same week. Same days. When I asked why that week, she tilted her head and said, "We're celebrating something worthwhile." The words hung there, heavy and deliberate. My mother avoided my eyes. My father changed the subject to airline miles. I didn't argue. Years of service teach you when speaking up will change nothing. I just said, "Have a good trip," and went back to planning an event they'd made clear they wouldn't attend. Mark noticed. He always did. One night, going over the guest list, he put his pen down and asked, "They're really not coming, are they?" I shrugged. He studied me the way he studied intel, quietly, carefully. "They're not embarrassed by the military," he said. "They're embarrassed by the fact that you didn't become what they wanted." That landed harder than I expected. He followed it with, "Their loss." I tried to believe him. The night before the ceremony, I sat alone in my quarters, staring at 3 RSVP cards I'd printed for my parents and sister. 3 names. 3 empty seats that would sit in the front row labeled family of the bride. I considered throwing them away. Instead, I left them. Some stubborn part of me wanted those empty chairs to be visible. Not as punishment. As truth. The ceremony itself was modest and precise. Folded flags on the tables. A short speech from my commanding officer. Mark beside me in dress uniform, calm and solid. When he slipped the ring on my finger, I didn't feel giddy happiness. I felt certainty. Around us were people who had seen me exhausted, scared, determined, and still showing up. These were my people. My parents' absence was loud. Others noticed the empty seats. When asked, I gave the same answer every time. They had other plans. No one pushed. Military people understand what it means when loyalty isn't returned. That night, out of habit, I checked my phone. Lydia had posted photos from London. Champagne glasses. A rooftop dinner. Her arm around my mother. The caption read, "Some celebrations actually matter." I stared at it longer than I want to admit. Then I set my phone face down and tried to sleep. By morning, the post had spread. Someone tagged me. Half my unit had seen it. Mark saw it too. He didn't say anything at first. Just looked at the screen, then at me. "Now I understand," he said. "Why you never talk about them." I wanted to defend my family, to soften it, to explain. Instead, I said the truth. "They don't see me." He nodded. "Do you still want to keep the wedding small?" I did. I told him I wanted something quiet. Just us. A few witnesses. He agreed. Or at least, I thought he did. What I didn't know then was that silence was about to end. That the blueprint of my family dynamics was about to become painfully clear. And that choosing not to fight, not to beg, was the first step toward drawing a line that would change everything. To understand what happened next, you have to understand where I came from. I grew up in a house where appearances mattered more than presence. My mother, Caroline, lived for charity luncheons and carefully curated friendships. My father, Richard, was a corporate attorney who believed success was measured in billable hours and social access. And Lydia, my younger sister, was everything they understood. Polished. Charismatic. Easy to admire. She knew how to shine in rooms that made me feel invisible. I was the opposite. I took apart radios just to see how they worked. I joined junior ROTC because I craved structure, not attention. When I told my parents I was joining the Navy instead of finishing my engineering degree, my mother cried like I'd announced a tragedy. My father stared at the wall for a long moment and said, "You'll grow out of this." I didn't. I grew into it. Boot camp stripped everything down to essentials. Competence. Discipline. Accountability. For the first time, my worth wasn't tied to how well I performed at dinner parties. It was tied to whether I could be trusted when things went wrong. I could. I thrived. Promotions came. Deployments followed. Commendations stacked quietly in my file. My parents never attended a single ceremony. Not my commissioning. Not my promotions. There was always an excuse. A migraine. A work conflict. A prior commitment. Lydia's milestones, on the other hand, were celebrated loudly. Expensive dinners. Champagne photos. Proud captions. I learned to stop expecting balance. Then I met Mark. We were both at a joint security conference, and I was presenting on communications intelligence. He sat 3 rows back and asked questions that told me he actually understood the material. Afterward, he introduced himself. No arrogance. No showmanship. Just calm confidence. We talked about work, then life, then everything in between. He'd grown up in Montana. Enlisted young. Worked his way up through sheer competence. Multiple deployments. Advanced degrees earned quietly while serving full-time. He never bragged. He spoke in facts, the way you do when you don't need validation. What I didn't know at first was how high his clearance was. Or how often he briefed people whose decisions shaped global policy. He never led with rank. To him, it was just responsibility. To me, he was the first person who saw my career and didn't flinch, minimize it, or try to explain it away. I wasn't a disappointment to him. I was a peer. When he proposed, it wasn't flashy. Just a bench overlooking the water in Annapolis. A simple ring. A simple question. I want to build a life with someone who understands service and shows up, he said. I want that to be you. I said yes without hesitation. After the London Post, something shifted inside me. I stopped making excuses. I stopped hoping the next achievement would finally matter. I started seeing the pattern clearly. My family wasn't indifferent. They were conditional. They showed up when something reflected well on them. They disappeared when it didn't. 2 weeks after the engagement ceremony, I was reviewing wedding documents when I noticed something odd. Names on the tentative guest list that didn't match the small and quiet vision I had in my head. Senior officers. Advisors. People I recognized from briefings, not social events. Then an email from Mark's aide confirming attendance from someone abbreviated as SECDEF. Secretary of Defense. I stared at the screen, confused. That night, over breakfast, I finally asked Mark directly. What's your actual rank? He blinked, genuinely surprised by the question. Major General, he said. 2 stars. Possibly 3 next cycle. He said it the way someone else might say their blood type. Everything snapped into focus. The security planning. The guest list. The quiet respect he carried without effort. And suddenly, the weight of what my family had dismissed hit me hard. They hadn't just skipped my engagement. They'd skipped it without ever bothering to ask who I was marrying, or what my life actually looked like. When word leaked, it spread fast. A short article. A headline mentioning a Pentagon general marrying a Navy officer in a private ceremony. Lydia found out the same way everyone else did. Through the internet. Her social media exploded with shock and sudden pride. Wait, is this my sister? She posted. Messages poured in. My parents called. Texted. Voicemails stacked up. Now they wanted details. Now they wanted to attend. Now it mattered. I didn't answer immediately. When I finally did, my response was brief and final. The guest list is closed. Security clearances are complete. Perhaps we can meet afterward. They panicked. They pleaded. They accused. My mother cried. My father claimed he knew people who could fix this. Lydia called me petty. None of them apologized for London. None of them acknowledged the caption. They were embarrassed, not remorseful. That's when I understood the difference between boundaries and revenge. Revenge is loud. Boundaries are quiet. Boundaries don't argue. They don't explain. They simply stand. The wedding day arrived faster than I expected. The base chapel was surrounded by security. Uniforms filled the room. Ribbons and medals caught the light. It felt unreal. My commanding officer walked me down the aisle because my father wasn't there. And somehow, that felt right. When I reached the altar and took Mark's hand, the noise faded. The ranks faded. The politics faded. There was just certainty. We said our vows. Simple. Direct. Honest. When the chaplain pronounced us married, the room stood. Not out of protocol. Out of respect. As we walked back down the aisle, I felt lighter than I had in years. The reception was a blur of congratulations and quiet awe. Senior leaders shook my hand and told me they were proud of me. Proud. A word I'd chased for decades. My phone buzzed relentlessly in my purse. I didn't check it until later that night. Dozens of messages. Shock. Accusations. How could you do this to us? You should have told us who he was. You made us look terrible. Not one congratulations. That was my answer. I blocked them all that night. My parents. My sister. Extended relatives who suddenly remembered my name. I cried. Not because I doubted my choice, but because I was finally letting go of the version of family I'd spent my life trying to earn. The silence afterward was heavy at first. Then it became peaceful. My life filled with real things. Work that mattered. A partnership built on respect. People who showed up without conditions. And that's when I realized the truth. I hadn't lost my family. I'd stopped negotiating with people who never valued me in the first place. The silence after the wedding didn't feel like peace at first. It felt unfamiliar, like standing in a quiet room after years of constant background noise. For weeks, I kept expecting something to break it. A knock on the door. A voicemail I couldn't ignore. A message that finally sounded like accountability instead of embarrassment. None came. What did come was clarity. The kind that settles slowly and stays. My family didn't disappear because I blocked them. They disappeared because I stopped chasing them. They tried, of course. Not directly. Not honestly. Emails routed through work addresses that never reached me. Messages passed through distant relatives who suddenly wanted to check in. My mother even tried calling Mark's office. His aide handled it professionally and permanently. Lydia switched tactics and went public. Photos from childhood. Carefully chosen captions about missing her sister. Comments filled with sympathy from people who had never asked how she treated me as an adult. I didn't respond. Silence, I learned, is not weakness. It's a boundary that doesn't negotiate. While they performed online, my real life kept moving forward. Mark and I settled into a rhythm that felt steady and intentional. 2 demanding careers. 2 calendars. 1 partnership. We didn't compete. We coordinated. We understood each other's silences and stressed the way only people shaped by service can. There was no need to explain why a bad briefing ruined a day or why a quiet evening mattered more than a social event. We showed up. Consistently. Without conditions. 3 months after the wedding, I was promoted again. Another ceremony. Another pinning. This one held at the Pentagon. My commanding officers were there. Mentors who had watched me grow. Colleagues who had trusted me with responsibility when it counted. Mark pinned my new insignia with the same calm pride he brought to everything. My family wasn't invited. For the first time, that didn't hurt. It felt appropriate. After the ceremony, a senior leader pulled me aside and said, "You handled your situation with grace." Not everyone does. I thanked him and realized something important. Grace isn't quiet endurance. Grace is choosing yourself without needing to punish anyone else. A letter arrived a few weeks later. Handwritten. My mother's stationery. I opened it once. It was careful. Polite. Full of phrases like we didn't understand and mistakes were made. The final paragraph gave it away. People were asking questions. Friends were confused. They were uncomfortable. Not remorseful. I threw it away without responding. That was the moment I knew I was done for real. Not angry. Not hurt. Done. 6 months after the wedding, Lydia reached out one last time. Not by phone. Not by text. LinkedIn. She wrote that they didn't know who Mark was. That they thought I was rushing into something. That they made a mistake. Can we talk? I read it slowly. What bothered me wasn't the message itself. It was the implication. That if they'd known who he was, they would have behaved differently. That my value had always been negotiable, dependent on how impressive my choices looked from the outside. That was the truth I couldn't unsee. I closed the app and didn't reply. Around that time, Mark and I were invited to dinner by one of my former commanding officers and his wife. Over dessert, they talked about something his father used to say. In the military, you build two families. The one you're born into and the one you choose. Sometimes they overlap. Sometimes they don't. What matters is knowing which one shows up when it counts. I felt that land deep. My chosen family had shown up. Over and over again. Without conditions. Without needing explanation. Publicly, our story became something else. Articles. Mentions. Quiet praise about partnership and modern service. Privately, it was simpler. Two people who understood duty choosing each other every day. No performance. No bargaining. Just respect. There was one moment, months later, that confirmed everything for me. I was standing in uniform after a joint commendation ceremony, listening as a reporter asked how I balanced marriage and service. I didn't talk about time management or sacrifice. I talked about alignment. About choosing someone who doesn't ask you to shrink. About integrating your life instead of compartmentalizing it. When asked about my family, I smiled and said they were supportive. And it was true. The family in that room. The people who had walked beside me. They were supportive. They understood. I didn't owe anyone a clarification beyond that. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the empty chairs at my engagement ceremony. About that caption. Some celebrations actually matter. At the time, it felt like a verdict. Now, it feels like a gift. Because it forced me to stop negotiating my worth. It forced me to choose myself. And in doing that, I gained something far more valuable than approval. I gained peace. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. Being strong doesn't mean tolerating disrespect. Loyalty doesn't mean self-abandonment. And walking away doesn't make you cold or selfish. Sometimes it makes you healthy. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do. I'm Natalie Brooks. I served my country. I built a life based on respect. And I finally learned that love doesn't need to be earned from people who refuse to see your value. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Have you ever been celebrated only after you became impressive to others? What boundary was hardest for you to keep? Would you have invited them after the London trip, or kept the guest list closed? Hit like if you believe boundaries are strength, not spite. Subscribe for more true stories about choosing yourself and taking your power back. And if you know someone who needs this reminder, share it with them. You're not alone.